In 1997, a black boy vanished without a trace from the streets of Los Angeles, leaving his mother with only unanswered questions and a community's whispered suspicions about police involvement. But 23 years later, a hiker walking his dog through Angeles National Forest unearthed something buried beneath decades of fallen leaves, evidence that would finally expose a truth powerful people had killed to keep hidden. Dorothy Williams pressed her palm against the glass-framed photograph on her nightstand, the same ritual she'd performed every morning for 23 years. Marcus smiled back at her from behind the glass, frozen at 14 in his Lakers jersey, basketball tucked under his arm. "Morning, baby," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of decades. "Mama's still looking for you." The house on Crenshaw Boulevard held its breath around her grief. Marcus's bedroom remained exactly as he'd left it that October morning in 1997. Homework scattered on his desk, Lakers posters covering the walls, sneakers kicked carelessly by the door. Dorothy had dusted every surface weekly, changed his sheets monthly, as if he might walk through that door any moment asking what was for dinner. She padded to the kitchen in her slippers, past the missing person flyers she'd never taken down, past the box of police reports she'd read 1,000 times. 23 years of searching, and she still didn't know who had taken her son from her. The not knowing was worse than any certainty could be. "Lord, if you're listening," she prayed quietly, hands wrapped around her favorite mug, the one Marcus had given her for Mother's Day, painted with his handprints when he was 7. "Please, just let me know what happened to my baby." 20 miles away, Thomas Chen adjusted his hiking boots and shouldered his backpack. The morning air in Angeles National Forest carried the scent of pine and possibility. These Saturday hikes had become his meditation, a way to clear his mind from the week's environmental impact reports and court testimonies about corporate pollution. Max, his golden retriever, bounded ahead on the familiar trail, nose to the ground in pursuit of some invisible treasure. Thomas followed the worn path deeper into the woods, his scientist's eye automatically cataloging the health of the ecosystem around him. "Max, stay close," he called, when the dog disappeared behind a cluster of manzanita bushes. The excited barking that followed wasn't Max's usual squirrel-chasing enthusiasm. Thomas pushed through the undergrowth and found his dog pawing at something partially buried beneath decades of fallen leaves and forest debris. "What did you find, boy?" Thomas knelt and carefully brushed away the organic matter, revealing the corner of what appeared to be an old suitcase. The leather was cracked and discolored, metal clasps green with oxidation. His methodical nature kicked in. He photographed the scene with his phone before disturbing anything further, then gently worked the case free from its earthen tomb. The clasps resisted at first, then gave way with a metallic groan. Inside, protected by plastic bags that had somehow survived the elements, were clothes. A Lakers jersey caught his attention immediately. Purple and gold fabric faded, but intact. He lifted it carefully and something crinkled in his hands. A tag sewn into the collar, with writing in black marker. Marcus Williams, followed by an address on Crenshaw Boulevard. Thomas stared at the jersey, his scientific mind processing the implications. This wasn't just discarded clothing. Someone had cared enough to label it, to preserve it. Someone was missing this. The drive back to Los Angeles felt endless. Thomas had carefully sealed the jersey in one of his specimen bags, treating it like the evidence it might be. The address led him through neighborhoods that had changed dramatically since he'd moved to LA 15 years ago. Gentrification pushing longtime residents further east and south. Crenshaw Boulevard held on to its character despite the encroaching change. The house that matched the address was small but well-maintained, with a garden full of roses and an American flag hanging from the porch. An older black woman was watering her plants, moving with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to find peace in routine. Thomas approached slowly, the jersey tucked under his arm. "Excuse me, ma'am. Are you looking for someone named Marcus Williams?" Dorothy's watering can slipped from her hands, hitting the concrete with a metallic clang. Water spread across the walkway as she stared at the purple and gold fabric Thomas held. Her legs went weak, and she grabbed the porch railing for support. "Oh my God!" she breathed, her voice breaking. That's my baby's jersey." Tears began streaming down her face as 23 years of hope and desperation collided. "Where did you find my baby's jersey? Please, please tell me you found my son." Thomas watched a mother's heart shatter and rebuild itself in the span of seconds. "Ma'am, I think we need to talk." Dorothy's hands shook as she led Thomas into her living room, clutching the jersey like a lifeline. The shrine that dominated one wall told the story of a life cut short. Photographs of Marcus at every age, his basketball trophies, certificates from school, candles that had been lit countless times. "Sit down," she said, her voice wavering between command and plea. "I need to know everything. Every single detail about where you found this." Thomas settled onto the couch, pulling out his phone to show the photos he'd taken. About 3 feet down, covered by years of forest debris. The suitcase was old, weathered. There were other clothes inside, but this jersey had his name and address. Dorothy's finger traced the faded writing, fresh tears spilling. "I taught him to write his information on everything. Case it gets lost," I'd tell him. "Never thought—" She couldn't finish. "Mrs. Williams, how long has Marcus been missing?" 23 years, 4 months, and 9 days. The precision of her answer revealed the weight she'd carried. "But he's not missing. Missing means we don't know what happened. Someone took my baby. Someone killed my baby. I just don't know who." She stood abruptly and disappeared down the hallway, returning with a thick manila folder and worn notebooks. "I've been investigating since the day he disappeared. The police gave up, but I never stopped looking." Thomas watched her spread documents across the coffee table with practiced efficiency. Police reports, witness statements, maps with locations marked in different colored ink, newspaper clippings yellowed with age. "Tell me about that day," Thomas said gently. Dorothy's breath caught, and suddenly she was back in that kitchen 23 years ago. The memory hit her like a physical blow. "October 15th, 1997, she began, her voice breaking. "Marcus left for school wearing this exact jersey. He had basketball tryouts after classes, was so excited he could barely eat breakfast." The flashback consumed her. "Mama, you think I'll make varsity?" Marcus had asked, bouncing a basketball against the kitchen wall despite her repeated requests not to. "Marcus Williams, stop that bouncing before you knock something over." But she'd been laughing, unable to contain her pride in his determination. "I'm gonna play for the Lakers someday, just like Magic Johnson. You gonna sit courtside and cheer for me." He'd kissed her cheek and grabbed his backpack. "Love you, Mama." "I love you too, baby. Come straight home after practice." "I will. Promise." But he never came home. Dorothy collapsed back into her chair, sobbing. "He promised me he'd come home. My baby always kept his promises, Mr. Chen. Always." Thomas moved closer, his heart breaking for this woman's pain. "Mrs. Williams, what did the police investigation find?" "Nothing!" The word exploded from her with 23 years of frustration. "They spent 2 weeks looking before they decided he was a runaway. Said he probably joined a gang or got involved with drugs. They didn't know my son. They didn't even try to know him." She wiped her eyes and pulled out witness statements written in her own careful handwriting. "So, I did my own investigation. I talked to everyone who saw Marcus that day. His friend Jerome was the last to see him around 3:30, walking toward the bus stop on Crenshaw. Did anyone else see him after that?" Dorothy's voice dropped to a whisper. "Mrs. Patterson from the corner store Thinks she saw him talking to someone in a car around 4 o'clock. But it was getting dark, and she couldn't make out faces, or even if it was really him. She pulled out more documents, her movements becoming frantic. I followed every lead, Mr. Chen. Every single one. Talked to gang members, drug dealers, other kids from school. Nobody knew anything. It's like my baby just vanished into thin air. Except now we know he didn't just vanish. Dorothy looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen. For 23 years, I've had nightmares about what might have happened to him. Was he scared? Did he call for me? Did he suffer? Her voice broke completely. But not knowing who took him, not knowing why, it's been eating me alive. She stood and walked to Marcus's photograph, touching the glass with trembling fingers. Every night, I promise him I'll find out what happened. Every morning, I wake up, and I'm still failing him. Mrs. Williams, you haven't failed him. You've spent 23 years searching for the truth. But I still don't know who killed my son. The anguish in her voice filled the room. I don't know their names, their faces, their reasons. I don't know if they're still out there, walking free, maybe hurting other children. Thomas studied the documents spread before them. This investigation you've done, it's incredibly thorough. You've gathered more evidence than most police departments would. Dorothy wiped her tears, her resolve hardening. And now we have something they can't ignore. We have proof that Marcus is gone, and we have a location. She turned to face Thomas, determination replacing despair. Mr. Chen, will you help me find out who killed my son? Yes, ma'am. We're going to find the truth. Dorothy had spent 3 sleepless nights researching before making her choice. Detective Sarah Martinez, assigned to the LAPD's cold case unit for the past 2 years, had a reputation in the community. One of the few officers people actually trusted. I know who you are, Dorothy said, as she settled into the chair across from Martinez's desk, Thomas beside her with the carefully preserved jersey. Rosa Delgado is my friend from church. She told me how you helped find her nephew's killer when everyone else had given up. Martinez looked up from her computer, studying Dorothy's determined but exhausted expression. Mrs. Williams, right? You called about new evidence in your son's case. That's right. Dorothy placed a thick folder on the desk, her hands trembling slightly. I need you to understand something before we start. I've been investigating Marcus's disappearance for 23 years, and I still don't know who killed my baby. The admission hung in the air, raw and painful. Dorothy's voice cracked as she continued, 23 years, Detective Martinez. 23 years of following dead ends, chasing shadows, hoping every phone call might be the one that brings him home. And I'm no closer to knowing who took him from me than I was the day he disappeared. She opened the folder with shaking hands, revealing meticulously organized documents, photocopied police reports, witness statements written in her own careful handwriting, maps with locations marked in different colored pens. Mrs. Williams, this is incredibly thorough, Martinez said, flipping through the pages. I was a school secretary for 35 years before I retired. I know how to keep records. Dorothy's voice wavered between pride and desperation. But all these records, all this work, and I still can't tell you who murdered my son or why they did it. Thomas gently unwrapped the Lakers jersey. Detective Martinez, this is what I found buried in Angeles National Forest. Along with other clothes that belonged to Marcus. Martinez pulled on latex gloves and examined the jersey, noting the faded but still legible name and address. How long do you estimate this has been buried? 23 years, Dorothy whispered, fresh tears starting. The same 23 years I've been going crazy, not knowing what happened to him. She leaned forward, her voice becoming urgent. Detective, I need you to understand how this feels. Every day for 23 years, I've wondered if the person who killed Marcus is someone I pass on the street, someone who shops at my grocery store, someone who sits next to me at church. Martinez set down the jersey carefully. Mrs. Williams, what was the original investigation like? Dorothy's laugh was bitter. What investigation? The officers barely spent 2 weeks before they decided Marcus was a runaway. They said he probably joined a gang, got mixed up with drugs. They didn't know my baby. They didn't even try. Do you remember the officers' names? Crawford and Santos. They treated me like I was bothering them every time I called asking for updates. Dorothy's voice hardened with old anger. Crawford told me to my face that boys like Marcus usually end up in trouble anyway. Like my son was already guilty of something just for being born. Thomas watched Martinez's expression darken. That's completely inappropriate. Inappropriate? Dorothy's voice rose. It was racist, and it was wrong, and it's why my son's case went nowhere. But here's what makes me so angry, Detective. I still don't know if they were just lazy cops, or if there was something more sinister going on. She pulled out witness statements. I've interviewed everyone who saw Marcus that day. Mrs. Patterson thought she saw him talking to someone in a car, but she couldn't identify who. Miguel Santos was working construction and saw a boy matching Marcus's description with 2 men, but he was too scared to come forward at the time. Why was he scared? Dorothy's voice dropped. Because in 1997, young black men in South Central didn't voluntarily talk to police, especially immigrant workers. Miguel didn't tell me what he saw until 2003, and by then, his memory was fuzzy about details. Martinez studied the documents. What do you think happened to Marcus? Dorothy broke down completely. 23 years of suppressed anguish pouring out. I don't know. That's what's killing me. Was it random? Did he see something he shouldn't have? Was he targeted? I've imagined every possible scenario, and I still don't have answers. She sobbed into her hands. My baby could have been killed by strangers, by people he knew, by police officers, by gang members. I've suspected everyone and no one because I don't have proof of anything. Thomas reached over and squeezed her shoulder. Mrs. Williams, that's why we're here, to finally get those answers. Dorothy looked up at Martinez with desperate hope. Detective, will you please help me find out who killed my son? I can't die not knowing. I promised Marcus I'd find the truth, and I'm running out of time to keep that promise. Martinez leaned forward, her voice firm with conviction. Mrs. Williams, I'm officially reopening Marcus's case. We're going to find out who did this to your son. Dorothy collapsed back in her chair, overcome with relief and terror. After 23 years, someone with authority was finally going to help her search for the truth. 3 days after Dorothy met with Detective Martinez, her phone rang at 2 a.m. Hello? She answered groggily, squinting at the caller ID that showed unknown number. Heavy breathing filled the line, then a distorted voice. Stop digging up the past, old woman. Some things are better left buried. Dorothy's blood turned to ice. Who is this? What do you want? Drop the investigation. Forget about the jersey. Forget about your son. Or you'll join him. The line went dead. Dorothy sat in her dark bedroom, clutching the phone, her whole body trembling. After 23 years of searching, someone was finally scared enough to threaten her, which meant she was getting close to something, or someone, dangerous. The next morning, she found a dead cat on her front porch. This isn't right, Thomas said when he arrived an hour later, having rushed over after her panicked phone call. We need to call Detective Martinez. Already did. She's on her way. Dorothy stood in her doorway, refusing to be intimidated, despite the fear in her eyes. But don't you see what this means? Someone knows we're investigating. Someone powerful enough to get my phone number. Someone who's been watching. Mrs. Williams, maybe we should slow down. Slow down? Dorothy's voice exploded with fury. Mr. Chen, someone just threatened to kill me because I'm trying to find out who murdered my son. That tells me we're on the right track. Martinez arrived within the hour, examining the dead animal and taking photos. Mrs. Williams, I'm going to be honest with you. This escalation concerns me. Maybe you should consider backing off until we have more resources. Dorothy's eyes blazed. Detective, with all due respect, I've been waiting 23 years for someone to take my son's case seriously. Now that someone's scared enough to threaten me, you want me to quit? I want you to stay alive. I've been dead inside for 23 years. Dorothy's voice cracked with raw emotion. My baby was taken from me, and whoever did it has been walking around free all this time. They think they can scare me into silence like they did back in 1997. They picked the wrong mother. She turned to both of them, her resolve hardening with each word. Someone killed my child and thought they got away with it. But now we have evidence, and they're panicking. Good. Let them panic. That afternoon, Dorothy made a decision that surprised even herself. She called Pastor Williams, her brother, and asked him to arrange a community meeting at the church. Dorothy, you sure about this? Pastor Williams asked, as they set up chairs in the fellowship hall. Going public might put you in more danger. I'm already in danger. Have been since the day Marcus disappeared. She straightened her shoulders. But you know what? I'm not the only mother in this community who's lost a child and never got answers. 50 people showed up that evening. Dorothy stood at the front of the room, Marcus's jersey spread on the table beside her, and told her story. She spoke about the phone threats, the dead cat, and her certainty that someone was trying to stop her investigation. How many of you have lost children to violence? She asked. How many of you never got real answers about what happened? Hands went up throughout the room. Mothers, fathers, grandparents, all carrying the same pain Dorothy knew too well. My son Marcus was murdered 23 years ago, she continued, her voice growing stronger. Someone buried his clothes in the mountains and thought they'd buried the truth with them. But truth has a way of coming to light. An older woman in the front row stood up. My grandson Jerome disappeared in 1998. Police said he was a runaway too. Another voice called out, My nephew Antonio, 2001, never found his body. One by one, families began sharing their stories of children lost and investigations that went nowhere. Dorothy listened to each one, her heart breaking and her resolve strengthening simultaneously. This is bigger than just Marcus, she said finally. This is about a pattern of our children disappearing and nobody caring enough to find the truth. She looked around the room at the grieving faces. Well, I care. And I'm not stopping until I find out who killed my son, even if it kills me. The room erupted in applause, but Dorothy could see the fear in their eyes too. Fear of retaliation, fear of what the truth might reveal, fear of hoping too much after decades of disappointment. But for the first time in 23 years, Dorothy didn't feel alone in her fight. The next morning, Dorothy arrived at the police station with a new sense of purpose, carrying a fresh notebook and the community contact list from the church meeting. Detective Martinez, I've been thinking about this all wrong, she said, settling into the chair across from Martinez's desk. For 23 years, I've been asking what happened to Marcus, but the real question is, who had contact with him that day? Martinez looked up from the case file she'd been reviewing. That's exactly the approach we need to take. Let's build a timeline of everyone who saw or spoke to Marcus on October 15th, 1997. Dorothy opened her notebook, pages filled with names and notes accumulated over decades. I've interviewed dozens of people over the years, but I want to go through them systematically this time. No more scattered searching. Start from the beginning. Who was the first person to see Marcus that day? Me. Dorothy's voice softened. He came into the kitchen around 7:30 for breakfast, excited about basketball tryouts, talking about his dreams of playing for the Lakers. She paused, gathering herself. He left the house at 8:15 to catch the school bus. Martinez wrote notes as Dorothy continued. His homeroom teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, marked him present at 9 a.m. His friend Jerome sat with him at lunch and walked partway home with him after school around 3:15. That's when Jerome last saw him? At the corner of Crenshaw and Florence. Jerome went east toward his house. Marcus continued north toward the bus stop. Dorothy's finger traced the route on a map she'd photocopied countless times. That's where the trail goes cold. Martinez leaned forward. But you mentioned other witnesses over the years. Mrs. Patterson from the corner store thought she saw Marcus around 4 o'clock, but she wasn't certain it was him. The lighting was poor, and she only got a glimpse. Dorothy flipped pages in her notebook. Then there's Miguel Santos, the construction worker. He was working on Florence Avenue that day. What did Miguel see? Dorothy's voice grew more intense. He saw a black teenager matching Marcus's description, talking to two men near a car. This was around 3:45, just 30 minutes after Jerome last saw him. Did Miguel provide descriptions of the men? That's where it gets complicated. Dorothy's frustration was evident. Miguel was undocumented in 1997. He was terrified of police, wouldn't come forward at the time. When I finally found him in 2003, his memory had faded. He remembered the boy looked scared, remembered the men were older, but couldn't recall specific details about their appearance. Martinez made more notes. Anyone else? A few people mentioned seeing police cars in the area that afternoon, but that wasn't unusual. There was Mrs. Chen, no relation to Thomas, who lived on Crenshaw. She was putting out trash when she heard voices getting loud somewhere nearby, but she didn't see anything. Dorothy's voice cracked slightly. The hardest part is knowing that someone out there saw what happened to my baby, but they either don't realize it or they're too scared to come forward. Mrs. Williams, after all these years, why do you think people would still be afraid to talk? Dorothy met her eyes directly. Because whoever killed Marcus has power. Real power. The kind that makes people disappear when they ask too many questions. Martinez felt a chill at Dorothy's words. What makes you think that? The threats started the moment we reopened this case. Whoever did this has been watching, waiting, making sure the truth stays buried. Dorothy's voice hardened with determination. But they made a mistake threatening me. It just proves we're getting close to something they don't want found. She stood up, gathering her papers. Detective, I want to re-interview every single person who might have seen Marcus that day. Someone knows more than they've said. Someone holds the key to finding out who killed my son. Where do we start? Dorothy's eyes blazed with renewed purpose. We start with Miguel Santos. It's time he told us everything he remembers about those two men. Miguel Santos lived in a small apartment in East L.A., his weathered hands telling the story of decades in construction. When Dorothy and Detective Martinez knocked on his door, his face immediately showed recognition and fear. Mrs. Williams, I told you everything I remember, he said nervously, glancing past them as if expecting to be watched. Miguel, please. We need you to try again. My son's killer is still out there. Dorothy's voice carried both desperation and determination. You're the only person who saw Marcus with those men. Reluctantly, Miguel let them inside. His small living room was filled with family photos and religious candles. He sat heavily in his worn armchair, avoiding eye contact. The boy was scared, Miguel began slowly. That's what I remember most. The way he kept looking around, like he wanted to run but couldn't. Martinez leaned forward. What about the men he was with? Older. White. One was bigger, thick like a football player. The other was thinner, had gray in his hair. Miguel's voice dropped. They weren't just talking to the boy. They were, how do you say, interrogating him. Dorothy's heart raced. Interrogating him about what? I don't know. But the boy kept shaking his head, like he was saying no to something. Then the bigger man grabbed his arm, and the boy tried to pull away. Miguel, Dorothy pressed, did you see where they took him? Miguel's hands trembled as he reached for a glass of water. Mrs. Williams, there's something I never told you, something I was too afraid to say. The room went silent. Dorothy gripped the arms of her chair. That morning, before I saw the boy with those men, I saw something else. Miguel's voice was barely a whisper. There was a deal happening. Drugs, money changing hands. Right there on Florence Avenue, in broad daylight. Martinez sat up straighter. Who was involved in the deal? Two men in suits. They looked like police, but they weren't in uniform. They were buying, not arresting. Miguel's eyes filled with fear. When the deal was done, one of them noticed me watching. He pointed at me, said something to his partner. That's when I got scared and went back to work. Dorothy felt her world shift. Miguel, are you saying Marcus might have seen this drug deal? The boy came walking down that street maybe 15 minutes later. If those men were still around, Miguel couldn't finish the sentence. Oh, God, Dorothy breathed, the pieces falling into place with horrible clarity. Marcus saw something he shouldn't have seen. Martinez's voice was tight with controlled anger. Miguel, can you describe these men in suits more specifically? The bigger one had a scar on his chin. The other one wore glasses, kept checking his watch like he was nervous. Miguel paused, then added reluctantly, Mrs. Williams, there's one more thing. I saw a police car parked around the corner. I thought maybe it was backup for the deal, you know? Like they were all working together. Dorothy stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. My baby was killed because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He saw corrupt cops dealing drugs, and they murdered him to keep him quiet. Mrs. Williams, we need to be careful about assumptions. No! Dorothy spun around, her voice filled with anguish. Don't you see? This is why the original investigation went nowhere. This is why witnesses disappeared. This is why I've been threatened. Tears streamed down her face. My 14-year-old son was murdered because he witnessed police corruption, and then the system covered it up for 23 years. Miguel buried his face in his hands. I should have come forward. Maybe if I had spoken up, they would have killed you too, Dorothy said quietly, her anger shifting to heartbreak. They were willing to murder a child to protect their secret. They wouldn't have hesitated to silence a witness. She turned to Martinez with desperate eyes. Detective, how many other witnesses do you think they've eliminated over the years? The threats escalated that very night. Dorothy's car tires were slashed. Her mailbox was vandalized with the words, "Shut up," spray-painted in red. When she woke up the next morning to find her garden destroyed, every rose bush trampled, every flower bed torn apart, something inside her snapped. That's it, she screamed, standing in the ruins of her carefully tended garden. You want to threaten me? You want to destroy everything I care about? Well, you already took the most important thing in my life. Thomas arrived to find Dorothy sitting on her front steps, surrounded by the destruction, tears streaming down her face as she clutched a photo of Marcus. Mrs. Williams, maybe it's time to consider— Don't! She cut him off, her voice raw with emotion. Don't you dare suggest I give up. Not when we're this close to the truth. But even as she said it, the weight of 23 years crashed down on her. Dorothy buried her face in her hands and sobbed. Not the quiet tears she'd shed over the years, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from her soul. I'm so tired, she whispered between gasps. I'm so damn tired of fighting for justice that should have been given freely. I'm tired of being strong when all I want is my baby back. Thomas sat beside her on the steps. No one would blame you if you needed to stop. But Marcus would blame me. Dorothy's voice cracked with anguish. Every night for 23 years, I've promised his picture that I wouldn't give up. How can I break that promise now? She stood up suddenly, pacing in front of her destroyed garden. They killed my 14-year-old son because he saw something he shouldn't have seen. Then they buried him like garbage and let me spend 23 years wondering if he was alive somewhere, if he was hurt, if he was calling for me. Her voice rose to a shout. They let me blame myself. They let me wonder if I could have protected him. They watched me tear myself apart with guilt and grief, and they said nothing. Pastor Williams arrived just as Dorothy reached her breaking point. Sister, what's going on here? They destroyed Mama's garden, Thomas explained quietly. Someone's trying to intimidate her into stopping the investigation. Pastor Williams took in the scene. The slashed tires, the vandalized mailbox, his sister's tear-stained face. Dorothy, maybe the Lord is telling you. Don't! Dorothy whirled on him, fury blazing in her eyes. Don't you dare tell me this is God's will. God didn't kill my son. Evil men did. And God didn't spend 23 years covering it up. Corrupt cops did. She collapsed against her brother, finally letting herself be vulnerable. I'm scared, William. I'm so scared. But I'm more scared of living the rest of my life not knowing who killed Marcus and why. Pastor Williams held his sister as she cried. What do you need from me? Dorothy pulled back, wiping her tears with determination. I need my church family. I need people who will stand with me when these killers try to silence me. You have us. You've always had us. Then I'm going public with everything we've learned. Dorothy's voice grew stronger with each word. If they want to threaten me, let them do it in front of the whole city. Let them explain why they're so desperate to keep a 23-year-old murder case quiet. Thomas looked concerned. Mrs. Williams, that could put you in serious danger. I've been in danger since the day I started asking questions about Marcus's disappearance. Dorothy straightened her shoulders, her resolve hardening. But you know what? They made a mistake when they decided to threaten me. Because now I know for certain we're on the right track. She looked at both men with fierce determination. They're scared, and they should be. Because I'm not backing down until everyone knows what they did to my son. Dorothy's decision to go public sent shockwaves through Los Angeles. Channel 7 News ran her story as their lead segment. Mother's 23-year search for justice. New evidence in cold case murder. Dorothy sat across from reporter Maria Gonzalez, Marcus's Lakers jersey displayed prominently between them. Mrs. Williams, you believe your son witnessed police corruption and was killed to silence him, Maria said. That's a serious allegation. It's not an allegation. It's the truth. Dorothy's voice was steady, her eyes blazing with conviction. My son Marcus was murdered because corrupt officers couldn't let him live with what he'd seen. They buried his body like he was nothing, then spent 23 years watching me suffer. The story spread across social media within hours. Justice for Marcus began trending. Dorothy's phone rang constantly. Reporters requesting interviews, community activists offering support, and anonymous callers making threats. That evening, as Dorothy sat in her living room answering emails from supporters, her phone rang. The caller ID showed unknown number. Mrs. Williams? The voice was different from the previous calls, older, more direct. Who is this? Someone who knows you're making a big mistake. You think you're close to the truth, but you're about to destroy innocent people's lives. Dorothy's heart pounded, but her voice remained strong. Innocent people don't threaten mothers looking for their children's killers. Crawford and Santos are good men who served this city with honor. Your son was a drug dealer who got in over his head." "My son was 14 years old," Dorothy shouted into the phone. "He was an honor roll student who dreamed of playing basketball. How dare you? Face the facts, lady. Your boy was in the wrong place at the wrong time because he was buying drugs. Those officers tried to help him, and things went wrong." Dorothy felt rage consuming her. "You're lying. You're all liars. Drop this crusade, or more people will get hurt. And we know where your brother's church is. Shame if something happened during Sunday service." The line went dead. Dorothy stared at the phone, shaking with fury and terror. They'd just threatened Pastor Williams and the entire congregation. Within an hour, Detective Martinez was at Dorothy's door. "Mrs. Williams, we need to talk about security measures." "They threatened my church," Dorothy said, her voice hollow with shock. "They threatened innocent people just because they're supporting me." "I know. We traced the call. It came from a burner phone, but we're working on it." Martinez sat down heavily. "There's something else. The call you just received? It mentioned Crawford and Santos by name." Dorothy looked up sharply. "Those were the original officers assigned to Marcus's case." "Exactly. Which means whoever called you knows specific details about the investigation that were never made public." Martinez leaned forward. "Mrs. Williams, I think we're dealing with people who were directly involved in your son's murder." The weight of that realization hit Dorothy like a physical blow. They're still out there, still covering for each other, still protecting themselves. "But they're panicking," Martinez pointed out. "Your media campaign is working. They're making mistakes, revealing information they shouldn't know." Dorothy stood up, pacing to Marcus's photograph. "Detective, what if they hurt people from my church? What if I'm putting innocent lives at risk? What if you stop now and let them get away with murdering your son?" Dorothy closed her eyes, feeling the weight of an impossible choice. Continue fighting and risk other people's lives, or surrender and let Marcus's killers walk free forever. When she opened her eyes, her resolve had crystallized. "My son died because he accidentally witnessed corruption. I won't let his death be meaningless by backing down now." She turned to Martinez with fierce determination. "Crawford and Santos, I want to know everything about them. Where they are now, what they're doing, who they're connected to. Because whoever called me tonight just gave us our first real lead in 23 years. Dorothy's relentless research into Crawford and Santos led her to an unexpected breakthrough. After hours of searching online records and making phone calls, she discovered that Santos had died of a heart attack 5 years earlier, leaving behind a widow named Elena Santos. "I found her address," Dorothy told Martinez the next morning, holding a piece of paper with trembling hands. "Elena Santos lives in Riverside. I want to talk to her." Mrs. Williams, approaching a widow about her deceased husband's potential crimes. That's delicate territory. "Detective, that woman might be the only person left who knows what really happened to Marcus." Dorothy's voice was firm with resolve. "I'm going to Riverside today, with or without you." 2 hours later, Dorothy stood on Elena Santos's doorstep in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The woman who answered was in her 70s, frail and using a walker, her eyes immediately showing recognition when Dorothy introduced herself. "You're Marcus Williams's mother," Elena said quietly. "I saw you on the news. Mrs. Santos, I need to ask you about your husband Rick. About October 1997. Elena's face went pale, and she quickly looked around the neighborhood as if someone might be watching. I don't know what you're talking about. Rick was a good officer. He served the community with honor." Dorothy stepped closer, her voice gentle but insistent. "Mrs. Santos, please. My son has been gone for 23 years. I just need to know what happened to him." Your son was a runaway. The police reports said, the police reports were lies. Dorothy's voice cracked with desperation. Mrs. Santos, I can see it in your eyes. You know something. Please, I'm begging you as one mother to another. Elena's hands trembled on her walker. Mrs. Williams, I think you should leave. I can't help you. But Dorothy had spent 23 years reading people's faces, learning to see past their words to the truth underneath. Elena Santos was terrified, but she was also carrying a burden that was eating her alive. Your husband changed after 1997, didn't he? Dorothy pressed gently. Something happened that October that haunted him for the rest of his life. Elena's composure cracked slightly. Rick never talked about work at home. But he did talk about it, didn't he? In his sleep, when he'd been drinking, when the guilt became too much to bear. Dorothy moved closer, her voice becoming more urgent. Mrs. Santos, I've spent 23 years living in hell, not knowing if my son is alive or dead, if he's suffering somewhere, if he needed me. Please don't let me die without knowing the truth. Elena backed away, shaking her head. You don't understand. There are people, dangerous people, who don't want these questions asked. What people? What are you afraid of? Nothing. I'm not afraid of anything. Elena's voice was high and panicked. Rick served this city honorably for 30 years. He was a good man who what? Dorothy interrupted. Who did something in October 1997 that destroyed his peace of mind for the rest of his life? Elena turned away, but Dorothy could see her shoulders shaking. Mrs. Santos, I know you're scared, but I also know you're in pain. Whatever your husband did, whatever happened to my son, it's been eating at you too. Please leave, Elena whispered. I can't leave, not when I'm this close to the truth about Marcus. Dorothy's voice broke with raw emotion. Mrs. Santos, look at me. Really, look at me. Elena turned slowly, and Dorothy could see tears forming in the older woman's eyes. I'm 67 years old. I've spent more than half my life searching for my son. I've knocked on thousands of doors, followed hundreds of leads, cried myself to sleep more nights than I can count. Dorothy's voice rose with passionate desperation. I have maybe 10 good years left on this earth, and I will not, die without knowing what happened to my baby. Elena's resolve was crumbling, but she still shook her head. You don't understand what you're asking. I'm asking for the truth. I'm asking for closure. I'm asking for the chance to finally lay my son to rest. Dorothy stepped forward, her eyes blazing with 23 years of suppressed anguish. Mrs. Santos, you're a mother too. You have children, grandchildren. How would you feel if one of them disappeared and someone who knew what happened refused to tell you? That's different. No, it's not different. Dorothy's voice exploded with pain and fury. It's exactly the same. Your husband knew what happened to my son, and now you know too. You're keeping a mother from her child. Elena began sobbing, her fragile composure finally shattering. You don't know what they'll do to me if I talk. Who? Who will do what to you? Crawford! He's still alive, still has friends in the department. Elena's words came out in a rush of terror and guilt. Rick was terrified of him even after they retired. Said Crawford would kill anyone who threatened to expose what they did. Dorothy felt her heart stop. What did they do, Mrs. Santos? What did Crawford and your husband do to Marcus? Elena collapsed into a chair, the weight of 23 years crushing down on her. Rick wasn't a bad man. He was weak, but he wasn't evil like Crawford. Tell me what happened to my son. They were taking money from drug dealers. Protection money. Elena's voice was barely a whisper. Rick said it started small, just looking the other way on minor deals. But then it grew bigger, more dangerous. Dorothy knelt beside Elena's chair, her voice gentle despite her racing heart. And Marcus saw something he shouldn't have seen. Elena nodded miserably. Rick said your son witnessed a big drug buy. Saw Crawford taking money from some dealer named Hernandez. The boy recognized Crawford from school events. So they killed him. Rick said Crawford panicked when the boy threatened to tell his mother. Rick wanted to just scare him, make him promise to stay quiet. But Crawford... Elena's voice broke completely. Crawford said they couldn't risk it. Dorothy felt the world tilt around her. After 23 years of wondering, of imagining every possible scenario, the truth was more brutal than her worst nightmares. Where is my son's body, Mrs. Santos? Elena was sobbing uncontrollably now. Rick kept detailed records. He was paranoid that Crawford would eventually kill him too, so he documented everything as insurance. What kind of records? A journal, photos, even audio recordings he made secretly. Elena looked up at Dorothy with tortured eyes. After Rick died, I found everything hidden in our garage. I've read it 100 times, and every time it breaks my heart all over again. Elena struggled to her feet and disappeared down a hallway, returning with a small metal box. Your son didn't deserve what happened to him. And you didn't deserve to suffer for 23 years not knowing. She handed Dorothy the box with trembling hands. Mrs. Williams, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't come forward sooner. I was too scared, too ashamed. Dorothy opened the box to find a leather journal, photographs, and several cassette tapes. The first entry in the journal was dated 3 months before Santos died. I can't sleep anymore. Every night I see that boy's face. Marcus Williams, 14 years old. Crawford shot him in cold blood, and I helped bury the body. God forgive me. I helped cover up the murder of a child. Dorothy's hands shook as she continued reading. 23 years of questions were finally being answered, but the truth was more devastating than she'd ever imagined. Mrs. Santos, she said quietly, will you help me make sure Crawford pays for what he did to my son? Elena nodded through her tears. It's time. Rick would want the truth to come out. He carried that guilt to his grave. Dorothy clutched the evidence that would finally bring her son's killer to justice. Marcus was coming home at last. Dorothy sat in her car outside Elena Santos's house for 20 minutes, staring at the box of evidence in her passenger seat. 23 years of searching, and the answers had been hidden in a garage in Riverside the entire time. Her hands trembled as she picked up her phone to call Detective Martinez. Detective, I have it. I have everything. Mrs. Williams? What do you mean? Santos's widow gave me his confession. Journal entries, photographs, audio recordings. Crawford killed my baby. The words came out in a rush, as if saying them quickly would make them hurt less. He shot Marcus in the back and buried him in the mountains. Dorothy could hear Martinez's sharp intake of breath. Mrs. Williams, are you safe? Where are you? I'm safe. I'm coming to the station now. Dorothy started her car with shaking hands. Detective, after all these years of not knowing, I finally understand what happened to my son. And it's worse than anything I imagined. As she drove back to Los Angeles, Dorothy felt a strange mixture of relief and devastation washing over her. Relief that the search was finally over, that she had proof of what happened to Marcus. But devastation at learning the brutal details of his final moments, running for his life through the mountains, shot in the back by a man sworn to protect and serve. She pulled over at a rest stop and opened Santos's journal again, reading his anguished words. Crawford said the boy would ruin everything. Said our careers, our pensions, our families would all be destroyed if Marcus talked. I wanted to find another way, but Crawford was already reaching for his gun. When Marcus started running, Crawford didn't hesitate. One shot to the back. The boy fell face first into the dirt and never moved again. Dorothy closed the journal and wept for her son's terror, for the 23 years she'd spent wondering, for the justice that had been denied for so long. But underneath the grief was something else, a fierce satisfaction that Crawford's time of hiding was finally over. 300 miles away in Phoenix, Jim Crawford was drowning in paranoia and guilt. Ever since Dorothy Williams had appeared on television with that damned Lakers jersey, his carefully constructed life had been unraveling. He'd barely slept in weeks, jumping at every unexpected sound, checking his security cameras obsessively. The threatening phone calls he'd made to Dorothy Williams had been desperate, impulsive acts that he immediately regretted. He'd used voice changers, burner phones, anything to hide his identity. But even as he made the threats, he knew he was making things worse. Each call had been driven by panic rather than strategy, a cornered animal lashing out without thinking. The night he'd slashed her tires and destroyed her garden, Crawford had driven to Los Angeles in a fog of bourbon and terror. He wasn't even sure what he'd hoped to accomplish. Scare her into backing down? Make her give up the investigation? All he'd managed to do was prove that someone powerful was desperate to keep the truth buried. Standing in Dorothy Williams's destroyed garden at 3 in the morning, Crawford had realized he was acting like an amateur, like a guilty man making obvious mistakes. But he couldn't stop himself. Every news report, every interview with Dorothy, every mention of the reopened case sent him deeper into a spiral of panic. Crawford poured himself another bourbon, his fourth of the afternoon. The alcohol dulled the edges of his conscience, but couldn't silence Santos's voice echoing in his memory. "We can't kill a kid, Jim. We can't cross that line." But they had crossed it. Crawford had crossed it. One moment of panic, one split-second decision to protect his pension and his reputation. And he'd murdered a 14-year-old boy in cold blood. The worst part was Santos getting religion before he died. Crawford had visited his old partner in the hospital during his final weeks, and Rick had been rambling about confession, about making things right with God. Crawford thought he'd talked him out of it, convinced him that admitting their crimes would destroy both their families. Apparently, he'd been wrong. Crawford walked to his bedroom window and peered through the blinds at the quiet suburban street. Everything looked normal. Kids riding bikes, neighbors watering their lawns, the mailman making his afternoon rounds. But Crawford couldn't shake the feeling that someone was coming for him. The threatening calls he'd made to Dorothy Williams played on repeat in his mind. What had he been thinking? Using distorted voices to tell her to drop the investigation and let sleeping dogs lie. It was like something out of a bad movie. And threatening her church? That had been the act of a desperate man who'd completely lost control. His phone rang, and he nearly jumped out of his skin. Unknown number. "Hello? Mr. Crawford? This is Detective Sarah Martinez with the LAPD. I'd like to ask you some questions about a case you worked in 1997. Crawford's blood turned to ice. "I'm retired, Detective. You'll need to go through proper channels if you want to discuss old cases. The case involves Marcus Williams, a 14-year-old boy who disappeared on October 15, 1997. You and Officer Santos were the investigating officers. That was over 20 years ago. I don't remember the details." Crawford's voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. "Mr. Crawford, we've recently recovered physical evidence in Marcus Williams's case. We'd appreciate your cooperation in helping us understand what happened." Crawford hung up without another word. They had evidence. Somehow, they had evidence. Santos must have kept records, documentation. something that tied them both to the murder. He grabbed his bourbon bottle and poured a larger glass, his mind racing through all the stupid mistakes he'd made in recent weeks. The threatening calls, the vandalism, the anonymous warnings that only proved someone was desperately trying to stop the investigation. Crawford had spent decades as a cop, knew better than anyone how investigations worked. Criminals always got caught because they panicked and did stupid things, and that's exactly what he'd been doing, acting like every guilty suspect he'd ever arrested. If they had enough evidence to arrest him, they would have sent local police, not called from Los Angeles. This was a fishing expedition. They suspected, but they didn't know for certain. But that Williams woman wouldn't give up. She'd been on every news station in Los Angeles, telling anyone who would listen that her son had been murdered by corrupt cops. Crawford had watched her interviews with growing dread, seeing the determination in her eyes, the absolute refusal to let the case die. He should have killed her years ago when she first started asking questions, should have made it look like a robbery gone wrong or an accident. But Santos had talked him out of it, said they'd already destroyed enough lives. Now it was too late. She had the whole city watching, supporters rallying around her cause. If anything happened to Dorothy Williams now, Crawford would be the obvious suspect. His doorbell rang, and Crawford froze. Through the peephole, he could see two men in suits standing on his porch. FBI, he realized with sinking dread. Not local police, not LAPD detectives, but federal agents. The game was over. Crawford considered not answering, but he could hear vehicles pulling up outside. Through his bedroom window, he saw black SUVs positioning themselves around his house. Tactical teams, weapons drawn, coordinated movements that spoke of careful planning. They weren't here to ask questions. They were here to arrest him. "Jim Crawford," a voice called through a bullhorn. "This is the FBI. Come out with your hands visible." Crawford sank into his recliner, the bourbon glass slipping from his numb fingers to shatter on the hardwood floor. For 23 years, he'd lived with the weight of what he'd done to Marcus Williams. And in recent weeks, his guilt and paranoia had driven him to make threat after threat, mistake after mistake. All those anonymous calls to Dorothy Williams, all those desperate attempts to scare her into silence, they'd only made him look more guilty. He'd been his own worst enemy, proving through his panic that he had something terrible to hide. But in his darkest moments, usually when he'd been drinking, Crawford remembered Marcus's face in those final seconds. The terror in the boy's eyes when he realized they weren't going to let him go. The way he'd tried to run through the forest, stumbling over roots and rocks, crying for his mother. "Mom! Mama, help me!" Those had been Marcus's last words before Crawford's bullet found its mark. Now Marcus's mother had finally found the truth. After 23 years of searching, Dorothy Williams had tracked down the evidence that would destroy him. Crawford stood up slowly, his arthritis making his movements stiff and painful. Outside, the FBI agents were growing impatient. "I'm coming out!" he called, opening his front door with hands raised. As the agents swarmed him, pressing him against his patrol car and reading him his rights, Crawford caught a glimpse of his neighbor's television through their front window. Dorothy Williams was on the screen, tears streaming down her face as she watched his arrest live on the news. "Jim Crawford, you're under arrest for the murder of Marcus Williams," Agent Rodriguez announced. For the first time in 23 years, Crawford felt something like relief. The waiting was finally over. 3 months had passed since Crawford's arrest. The media circus surrounding the trial had been relentless, with reporters camped outside the courthouse and legal experts analyzing every piece of evidence on television. Dorothy had endured countless interviews, each one forcing her to relive the details of Marcus's murder. But she knew this was the price of finally getting justice for her son. Now, sitting in the packed courtroom as opening statements began, Dorothy felt the weight of 23 years of searching culminating in this moment. Everything she had fought for, every lead she had followed, every sleepless night she had endured. It all came down to convincing 12 strangers that Jim Crawford was a cold-blooded killer. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, District Attorney Rebecca Chen began. 23 years ago, 14-year-old Marcus Williams left for school, excited about basketball tryouts. He never came home because Officer Jim Crawford murdered him to cover up police corruption. Chen methodically laid out the prosecution's case, Santos's detailed journal, the physical evidence, Miguel's eyewitness testimony, and Dorothy's decades of investigation. But Dorothy could see the challenge they faced. 23 years was a long time. Memories had faded, and key witnesses had died. Crawford's defense attorney, Mark Sullivan, was equally methodical in his opening statement. The prosecution asks you to convict a decorated police officer based on the writings of an alcoholic who died 5 years ago and the theories of a grieving mother who has spent over 2 decades trying to blame someone, anyone, for her son's disappearance. Sullivan painted Santos as an unreliable narrator whose guilt over unrelated corruption had led him to create elaborate fantasies. He questioned the chain of custody for the buried evidence and suggested that Dorothy's investigation had been so single-minded that she'd ignored alternative explanations for Marcus's disappearance. As the trial progressed over the following weeks, Dorothy watched the jury's faces carefully. Some seemed moved by her testimony about Marcus's character and dreams. Others appeared skeptical when Sullivan cross-examined her about her investigative methods. The middle-aged black woman in the front row nodded sympathetically when Dorothy described the police department's initial dismissive attitude. But the older white man in the back seemed more convinced by Sullivan's arguments about reasonable doubt. Miguel Santos took the stand and testified about seeing Marcus with 2 men on the day he disappeared. But Sullivan's cross-examination revealed gaps in his memory and his initial reluctance to come forward. Elena Santos testified about finding her husband's confession materials, but Sullivan suggested she could have misunderstood Rick's guilt over other matters. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as each side scored points and suffered setbacks. Dorothy could feel the case teetering on a knife's edge. Some jurors seemed convinced of Crawford's guilt, while others appeared to have reasonable doubts. During a mid-afternoon recess in the 3rd week of trial, Dorothy found herself in the courthouse hallway when Crawford emerged from the men's room, temporarily separated from his legal team. For 23 years, she had imagined this moment, being alone with her son's killer. "Jim Crawford," she said quietly. He turned, his face immediately showing wariness when he saw her approaching. "Mrs. Williams, I don't think we should be talking without our attorneys present." Dorothy moved closer, her voice low but intense. "I don't care what you think. I've been waiting 23 years to tell you exactly what I think of you." Crawford glanced around nervously, looking for his lawyers or court security. "Mrs. Williams, this isn't appropriate." "Appropriate?" Dorothy's voice rose slightly. "You want to talk about what's appropriate? Was it appropriate when you murdered my 14-year-old son? The jury will decide." "The jury doesn't know you like I know you," Dorothy interrupted, stepping closer until Crawford backed against the wall. "I've spent 23 years studying every detail of what you did to Marcus. I know exactly what kind of monster you are." Crawford's face flushed. "I'm not a monster. I was a good cop who—" "You're a child killer!" Dorothy's voice carried down the hallway, causing several people to turn and stare. "You murdered an innocent boy to protect your drug money, and then you spent 23 years watching me suffer while you lived free." "Keep your voice down," Crawford hissed, clearly uncomfortable with the attention they were drawing. "Why? Are you embarrassed?" Dorothy's eyes blazed with fury. "Are you ashamed to have people know what you really are?" A coward who shoots children in the back? Crawford tried to move away from her, but Dorothy blocked his path. You know what I've thought about every day for 23 years? My son's final moments. How scared he must have been when he realized you weren't going to let him go home. Mrs. Williams, please. Please what? Please stop telling the truth about what you did? Dorothy's voice was building in intensity. Marcus was terrified, wasn't he? He called for me, didn't he? He died calling for his mama, while you and Santos decided his life was worth less than your pension. Crawford's composure was cracking. You don't know what you're talking about. I know exactly what I'm talking about. I know that you forced my baby into your patrol car and drove him to the mountains like he was some kind of criminal. Dorothy's voice echoed off the marble walls. I know that when he tried to run for his life, you shot him in the back like an animal. Stop it, Crawford whispered, sweat beading on his forehead. Why? Does the truth make you uncomfortable? Dorothy stepped even closer, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper. For 23 years, I've wondered if Marcus suffered, if he was in pain, if he understood what was happening to him. Now I know he died in terror because of you. Crawford was trembling now. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. But it did happen like that. You made it happen like that. Dorothy's control finally snapped, and she began shouting. You looked into the eyes of a scared child, and you decided he had to die. You're not a police officer. You're a murderer. I know. Crawford broke down completely, his voice cracking. God help me. I know what I did. Dorothy stared at him, this broken man who had destroyed her life. You took everything from me. My son, my peace, my faith in justice. You are the worst kind of monster, one who hides behind a badge while destroying innocent lives. She leaned in close, her voice filled with 23 years of suppressed rage. Whatever happens in that courtroom, you'll never be free from what you did to Marcus. You'll carry that guilt until the day you die. And even then, it won't be enough. Crawford slumped against the wall, completely shattered. Before he could respond, his attorneys appeared around the corner, immediately rushing to separate them. Mrs. Williams, you cannot be speaking to our client, Sullivan said sternly. I'm done talking to him, Dorothy replied, her voice steady again. I've said everything I needed to say. She walked away, leaving Crawford sobbing against the courthouse wall. When the trial resumed, Crawford seemed different, more withdrawn, less confident. His attorneys had to prompt him to sit up straight, and Dorothy noticed he kept glancing at her with haunted eyes. The prosecution's closing argument was powerful, with D.A. Chen weaving together all the evidence into a compelling narrative of corruption and murder. Marcus Williams died because he witnessed police corruption, and Officer Crawford chose to silence him permanently rather than face the consequences of his actions. Sullivan's closing was equally strong, emphasizing the lack of direct physical evidence and the reliance on circumstantial proof. You cannot convict a man of murder based on speculation and the writings of a dead alcoholic, no matter how tragic Marcus Williams's disappearance may be. When the jury retired for deliberations, Dorothy felt her entire life hanging in the balance. 4 hours later, they returned. Has the jury reached a unanimous decision? Judge Morrison asked. We have, Your Honor, the foreman replied. Dorothy held her breath, 23 years of hope and pain crystallizing into this single moment. On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted in cheers and sobs of relief. Dorothy collapsed into Thomas's arms, overwhelmed by the realization that Marcus had finally received justice. Across the courtroom, Crawford sat stunned as his attorneys immediately began discussing appeals. Judge Morrison sentenced Crawford to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As they led him away in shackles, Crawford looked back at Dorothy one final time. She met his gaze without flinching, knowing that her son's killer would spend the rest of his life behind bars. 23 years of searching had finally ended with justice for Marcus Williams. 6 months after Crawford's conviction, Dorothy stood in the bright morning sunlight at Forest Lawn Cemetery, holding a simple bronze marker that read, "Marcus Williams, beloved son, 1983–1997. His dreams live on." After 23 years of not knowing where her son rested, she finally had a place to say goodbye. The search and recovery operation in Angeles National Forest had taken 3 weeks. Using Santos's detailed journal entries and Crawford's confession, investigators had located Marcus's remains exactly where the documents indicated. Dorothy had been there when they found him, clutching Thomas's hand as the forensic team carefully excavated what was left of her baby. "He's coming home, Mrs. Williams," Detective Martinez had said quietly that day. "Marcus is finally coming home." Now, as the cemetery workers finished installing the headstone, Dorothy knelt and placed a fresh Lakers jersey beside the marker, the same purple and gold he'd been wearing the day he disappeared. "I kept my promise, baby," she whispered, her voice strong despite the tears. "I never stopped looking for you. I never gave up." Pastor Williams approached and placed a gentle hand on his sister's shoulder. "Marcus would be so proud of you, Dorothy. You never let the world forget him." "I couldn't let them get away with it," Dorothy replied, standing and brushing dirt from her knees. "My son deserved justice, and every other child who might have been next deserved protection." The Marcus Williams Foundation had been established within weeks of Crawford's sentencing. Donations poured in from across the country. Families who had lost children to violence, community activists who had followed Dorothy's story, and ordinary people moved by her 23-year fight for justice. Thomas, who had become like an adopted son to Dorothy, served as the Foundation's volunteer coordinator. "We've already helped locate 3 missing children," he reported during their weekly meeting. "The database you created of investigative techniques is being used by families nationwide." The Foundation's office, located in the same south-central neighborhood where Marcus had grown up, buzzed with activity. Volunteer investigators helped families navigate police bureaucracy, provided resources for private searches, and connected grieving parents with others who understood their pain. Elena Santos had become an unexpected ally, using her late husband's pension to fund the Foundation's work. "Rick would want his guilt to serve some purpose," she told Dorothy during one of their monthly meetings. "Maybe helping other families will balance some of the harm we caused." Detective Martinez, who had been promoted to lieutenant after successfully closing several cold cases inspired by Dorothy's methods, stopped by the Foundation regularly. "You've changed how we approach these investigations," she told Dorothy. "The department has implemented new protocols for missing persons cases, especially involving children." The protocols were unofficially called Marcus's Rules, requirements for thorough witness interviews, proper evidence preservation, and mandatory follow-up investigations when cases were initially classified as runaways. Dorothy's story had sparked broader conversations about police accountability and missing persons investigations. The Los Angeles Times ran a 5-part series examining other unsolved cases from the 1990s, several of which were now being reopened with fresh eyes. "Crawford wasn't working alone," Dorothy said during a television interview 6 months after the trial. "There were other officers involved in corruption, other cases that deserve scrutiny. Marcus's story isn't just about one murdered child. It's about systemic failures that let killers hide behind badges." The interview requests never stopped coming, but Dorothy was selective about which ones she accepted. Her focus remained on the Foundation and helping other families, not on reliving her own trauma for entertainment. "Some reporters want to sensationalize Marcus's story," she explained to Thomas. "But this isn't about me anymore. It's about making sure no other mother has to fight for 23 years to get answers about her child. Dorothy's relationship with Thomas had evolved into something resembling family. He visited every Sunday for dinner, helped with foundation business, and had become the son she'd never been able to raise after losing Marcus. "You saved my life, too," Thomas told her one evening as they reviewed grant applications. "Finding that jersey, meeting you, it gave my life purpose I didn't know I was missing." "Marcus brought you to me," Dorothy replied with a smile. "My baby is still taking care of his mama, even now." The Foundation's annual scholarship program awarded college funding to students from South Central who demonstrated academic excellence and community involvement. The kind of young people Marcus might have become friends with, might have mentored if he'd lived. At the first scholarship ceremony, Dorothy addressed the recipients with words that had become her mission statement. Marcus dreamed of playing for the Lakers, but his real dream was bigger than basketball. He wanted to make his community proud, to show the world that kids from South Central could achieve anything. You are living his dream. Crawford's appeals had all been denied. He would spend the rest of his life in state prison, and Dorothy felt no satisfaction in his suffering, only relief that he could never hurt another child. As Dorothy drove home from the cemetery that morning, she passed the corner where Marcus had last been seen alive. For the first time in 23 years, she didn't feel the crushing weight of unanswered questions. She felt something she hadn't experienced since October 15th, 1997. Peace. Marcus Williams was home. His story had sparked change that would protect other children. His mother's promise had been kept. The fight for justice was over, but the fight to honor his memory would continue for the rest of Dorothy's life. And that felt exactly right. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please like the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.